Hey there, it's Dr. Claw with an explanation of how the interpretive lens assignments work. And this explanation applies to all of the interpretive lens assignments, though I am today looking specifically at the hybridity, identity, and monstrosity in medieval Britain reading. So one thing to know about the interpretive lens texts is that they require some new reading that you then apply to one of the normal texts from our monsters class. And I'm going to actually jump down in the assignment instructions to the definition section because that's going to help you understand what I'm even talking about. So the interpretive lens reading, so whatever new thing you're going to read, will be a secondary text. And what that means is that it's a piece of writing that thinks through a primary text in some way. So usually it's a piece of writing about a piece of writing. It's someone who is analyzing, interpreting, or thinking critically about another piece of writing. And specifically, it's going to be doing that about a primary text. A primary text is an original piece of literature. So all of the texts that we do battle with and that are our monsters texts, those are primary texts. Examples include the Topography of Ireland, Beast Claveret, Frankenstein. So they're going to be the works of literature in this class, or in the case of the Hereford Mapamundi, the map. So it's the original creation. So it's usually a story, it's usually fictional in some way. So a secondary text will be someone else analyzing or interpreting one of these primary texts. So for each of the interpretive lens assignments, I have provided you with a secondary text to read. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these assignments is that generally secondary texts are a little bit harder to read than primary texts because you have to not only understand the primary text, but you have to be able to follow along with someone else's interpretation of that primary text. And some of the secondary texts, like this one, are not even about a specific primary text. You'll be able to choose what primary text you want to kind of apply the interpretation to. So the goal of this assignment is to understand a scholarly perspective on your chosen text. I want to see that you can summarize the main argument of the secondary text. So as you're reading, think through, what is this author saying? What is their main argument as they're thinking through this interpretation? Then I want to see that you can apply the interpretive lens that the scholar is using to the primary text that you choose. You will choose quotations from both the primary and secondary text to support your reading, and I want to see that you can use the interpretive lens proposed in the secondary text correctly. So this is one of those assignments that it's not going to be entirely clear what you're doing and what I'm talking about right now until you've actually read one of these. Some of them are going to be easier than others. This one is relatively short. It's about 10 pages, and even though it is a scholarly text, it's a published book, it's not as hard to understand the author's language as maybe some of the other ones. And then you'll find some other ones that are a little bit easier. So feel free to look through the resource that I provide at the top of each interpretive lens assignment and see which one might work best for you in terms of the language and also in terms of what are they focusing on. Okay, and as a tip, you can use the critical thinking questions from our critical reading assignments to help you read and understand the secondary text. Okay, so what are you going to do in this assignment? What's the action you take? So step 1, you'll write a summary of your chosen secondary text and explain the basic concept of the interpretation proposed by the text. I have provided some questions to help you come up with your summary. So use these questions, answer them, and format your answers into a paragraph to have your summary. That's the first paragraph. The second step is where you start to apply that basic idea that you just summarized to a primary text from our syllabus that you have chosen. So again, an example of a primary text will be any of the battle text from our monsters class. So Frankenstein, Orinoco, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, any of those main texts that you can do the kind of other class assignments about, those would be one of the primary texts that you apply that summary to. So using the argument that you've summarized, how does it apply to the primary text that you have chosen? You'll do this in a new paragraph as you explain how you can apply that interpretive lens to your primary text. Again, I've provided you with some questions to help you create the content of this second paragraph. So answer these questions and put that content together, your responses to these questions, put those together into a second paragraph. Once you've answered the questions in each of these steps, you'll probably need to do some revision as you kind of put those sentences together in a way that makes sense. But basically, you're going to pick 2 quotes from your primary text that you want to try to interpret using this new method that you just summarized. And then you can choose between 2 and 4 quotes from the secondary text to help you explain your primary text. And there's a range here because I want you to do a minimum of 2 quotes from your secondary text. But I know that sometimes if your secondary text is particularly complicated, or maybe it's got kind of more than one aspect to it that you'd like to cover, you might need a couple of additional quotations in order to demonstrate how that can apply to your primary text. After you've chosen all of your quotes, explain how each of the 2 to 4 secondary quotes help you interpret the 2 primary quotes. And then finally, you'll have a kind of concluding reflection section of that paragraph where you think about how the interpretive lens can help you understand a big picture idea from the primary text. So this is where you move beyond just the specific quotations you looked at and say, okay, well, what larger idea or larger concept do I now understand something about having used this interpretive lens on this primary text? And then you'll submit your 2 paragraphs in the same Word document, and please include your name on this in all assignment submissions. So yeah, this is definitely a harder assignment, and that's why you aren't required to do as many of these as you are of the other assignments. And it's also worth a lot more points than the other assignments because it is harder. It's asking you to kind of take your literary analysis to a new level, and you're basically incorporating some research into your analysis of the primary text. The only difference from a research paper is that I am providing you with the source in this particular situation. Okay, so let's have a look at the rubric. I am going to look at your accuracy. So this is sort of the first thing to think through. Do you understand what your secondary text is saying? And this is easier said than done sometimes. These texts are not easy. They're complicated, and they're meant to be that way. So please don't get discouraged if on your first read through you're like, I'm not sure I understand that. Usually secondary texts where they're writing about writing, they take more than one read through to really understand them. So apply those strategies that you read about in the digital reading strategies from training camp. Read actively, take notes as you go, note down places that you don't understand so that you can come back to those, and give it time. Look at more than one, look at the text more than once. I would like to see you in your summary fully explain the interpretive lens. So show me that you understand the whole argument of what you've read, and don't omit any aspects of the argument in order to attain the excellent rating for accuracy. Okay, interpretation. This is the hard part, but it's also the most fruitful part that can really help you expand your interpretations of our primary text. All right, so is the interpretation that you've made thoughtful? And does it address a big picture idea? So I want to see that you're not just regurgitating what this other author has said, but you're making it a conversation where you're like, okay, well, now I have this new perspective from this author of the secondary text, and now I am going to think about how that perspective helps me make my own new interpretation. So it's still your interpretation, your work, but now you've got kind of a bigger toolbox to pull from. So I want to see, that's what I mean by thoughtful. Are you showing your own thoughts and how they have developed and gotten more complex using this secondary text? And are you addressing that big picture idea that the prompting questions ask you about? Does the big picture idea that you decide to talk about clearly relate to the interpretive lens? And does the big picture idea that you are talking about clearly relate to the primary text? So you want to make sure that whatever big idea you're looking at doesn't just connect to one thing. So it's not just a big idea that relates to the secondary text, and it's not just a big idea that relates to the primary text, but it's a big idea that actually connects those two. So you can think of your big idea as maybe the top of a triangle where it's connecting that secondary text and that primary text. And then finally, is your submission complete? Do you have both paragraphs? Does one of those paragraphs summarize the secondary text and explain how that secondary text provides an interpretive lens? Does the second paragraph include your 2 quotes from the secondary text and 2 from a primary text? Do both paragraphs answer all of the questions in the instructions, and does it answer them thoughtfully? So that's what I'm looking for as I evaluate your secondary, your interpretive lens assignment that's looking at a secondary text. So again, it is tough, but I recognize that, and you're going to get lots of points for doing it, and it's going to lead you to a much more complex interpretation of the primary text that you choose. So if you have any questions, as always, please tag me on YellowDig with the @ symbol, and be sure to include the Q&A tag as well so that other students can find it.